3711 Mustang horses found an unconscious veteran in the forest. What happened next shocked everyone. When a search team found the unconscious body of a man lying in the frost, they weren't the first to arrive. 11 wild horses stood around him in absolute silence. Not a hoof moved, not a sound was made, as if they were guarding something sacred. What followed wasn't science. It wasn't instinct. It was something else. And it changed everything people thought they knew about the wild. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Eli McRae was a man of few words and even fewer visitors. For nearly 7 years he had lived in a small weathered cabin known as the Outpost Ranch House, located nearly 30 miles from the nearest town. The only direct link to civilization was an unpaved road that disappeared into the rolling sagebrush plains, and a weak radio signal that sometimes crackled with distant voices. Locals in town whispered that Eli never bothered to install a television, and that his cell phone, if he even owned one, would be useless out here. The only amenities he relied on were an old UHF radio, a noisy generator for basic electricity, and a wood-burning stove that warmed him through harsh winters. Yet for Eli, this secluded way of life was a blessing, not a curse. His cabin rested just beyond the boundary of the Sagebrush Basin Preserve, a vast, arid land of stubby grass, scattered sage, and hard-packed earth. The preserve was a protected zone, known for its dry, windy plains, and the wild horses that roamed them. Many considered it a barren landscape, but Eli saw life in every crooked tree and every patch of sun-scorched earth. He relished the quiet. He had chosen it after all, and found small joys in the things most people took for granted: the sudden turn of the wind, the distant bark of a coyote, and the steady rhythm of his own heartbeat. Before becoming a ranger, Eli had served over a decade in the military, deploying to conflict zones in the Middle East and parts of South America. He didn't talk about those years, and the rare times he did, his voice grew tight. His words clipped. It wasn't the physical scars that drove him away from his old life. He'd come back more or less intact. Rather, it was the invisible wounds, the ones that flared in his dreams and haunted his quiet moments. He had lost friends to roadside bombs and sniper fire, lived through punishing desert patrols, and endured nights in jungles brimming with unfamiliar noises, some merely the cries of nocturnal creatures, others more ominous. When he finally left the service, there was little fanfare, a handshake, a final salute, and a sense that part of him had been left in those foreign battlegrounds. He drifted for a time, uncertain where to settle, until a chance encounter with a state wildlife official landed him a job as a ranger. He didn't choose the wilderness because he adored nature with poetic reverence. He simply wanted a place that wouldn't ask him too many questions. A place that didn't pry into why he woke in cold sweats, or stared for hours at the horizon, remembering things he wished he could forget. Those who spoke to Eli found him polite but distant. He measured each word as though it might trigger an unseen landmine. In a world that demanded chatter and constant updates, he was an anomaly, a man who valued silence above all else. Every evening he sat at a small table under the glow of a single lamp and wrote in a journal with a blue ink pen. His entries were never lengthy, 1 or 2 lines at most. Wind from the west, quiet day, or saw a small hawk circling near the ridge. Clouds by noon. When asked why he bothered, he would shrug. "It helps me keep track," was all he would say. Surprisingly, Eli excelled at reading the land, whether it was footprints left by a passing coyote, or the faint tracks of an off-road vehicle. If a tourist got lost, he could backtrack them in hours. That talent, combined with his comfort and solitude, made him the perfect ranger for the Sagebrush Basin. He had no fear of being alone in the desert or along remote trails. His decade in the military had stripped him of illusions. He believed in caution, not in dismissing warnings, but he also believed in trusting gut instincts when there was no time for logic. Every morning, often before dawn, painted the sky with hints of pink and gold. Eli followed the Mesa Creek Trail. It was a rugged, unmaintained path that wound along an old creek bed, dry most of the year, and climbed gently toward a plateau of scattered pines and wind-blown rock formation. The trail was notoriously prone to erosion and rock slides, causing it to shift with each passing season. Many considered it unsafe to traverse alone. Yet for Eli it was routine, a ritual that centered him. He'd check for any sign of illegal activity, note fallen rocks that might block visitors, and keep a lookout for changes in the wild horse territory deeper inside the preserve. The Mustangs that roamed these parts were a fierce, iconic presence, descendants of Spanish horses left free to roam for generations. While the preserve officially protected them, the land was vast, and poachers or those seeking to capture wild horses for private ranches sometimes slipped through the cracks. Eli never tried to tame them. He observed from a respectful distance, rarely interfering unless human malice was at play. His unspoken agreement with the herd was simple. He would walk quietly, keep his presence unobtrusive, and leave no trace. In return, the Mustangs neither fled nor challenged him. He suspected they were aware of him in more ways than he could confirm. Once, out of curiosity, he placed a sliced apple on a broad, flat stone near a trail crossing. The next morning, the apple was gone, and in its place was a distinct hoof mark pressed firmly into the soft dirt. An intentional response, or so it seemed. He never mentioned it to anyone. It was enough for him to note it in his journal. Apple gone, mark left, someone under. In his own quiet manner, Eli found a fragile equilibrium between himself and the wilderness. It wasn't that he believed in grand cosmic mysteries. It was simply that after experiencing so many inexplicable events in war, where death might come from a single step on the wrong patch of ground, he understood the importance of respecting what couldn't be fully explained. One cold morning, Eli set out earlier than usual. Dawn was just a pale promise on the horizon, the air hovering around freezing, and a thin coat of frost glittered on every stone. He carried his usual gear, a small radio, a folding knife, a compact pair of binoculars, and his leather-bound journal. His breath formed clouds as he exhaled, and the chilled wind tugged at the brim of his faded ranger hat. The dryness of Sagebrush Basin could be deceptive. Nights here could dip below zero, and daylight often soared into the high 70s or 80s. He was used to extremes, but that morning the frost had a slick sheen he hadn't encountered since last winter. As he walked, the sky gradually lightened, revealing the sculpted silhouettes of distant rock formation. Red Bluff Ridge was his intended destination, a precarious outcropping overlooking a thick stand of pines. During spring and winter, this ridge was prone to landslides, and it was usually off-limits. However, routine checks were necessary to document any new rockfalls or soil erosion, then relay that data back to the main ranger station in town. Red Bluff Ridge wasn't just a patch of ground. Its soil was tinged with iron oxide, giving the land a rusty hue, and the underlying bedrock was loose in place. Standing at the edge felt like being suspended above a green and brown sea of forest. Any misstep, people said, could send you tumbling down into the waiting pines below. Yet whenever a coworker questioned the wisdom of going there alone, Eli would answer in his measured way, "If I don't check, who will?" That morning, with the wind blowing from the west, he noticed the temperature had dropped further than expected. Fine crystals of ice clung to gravel and rock, forming a thin, nearly invisible layer. He paused once to test the ground carefully, stepping forward. Each foothold felt secure enough until it didn't. At one particular point, a flat stone jutting out near the edge, Eli sensed the sole of his boot slide. It was just a few centimeters, but enough to send a shot of alarm through his body. He halted, bracing himself by shifting his weight back. Normally he would have calmly retracted, but in that instant a brittle web of frost under the stone fractured. The ground slipped away like a trapdoor. He lunged backward, hoping to grab a rooted bush or a solid outcrop, but found only open air. The stone gave way under him, dragging a thin crust of half-frozen dirt with it. He fell sideways, hitting the exposed edge of a half-buried boulder, then tumbled further down the ridge. The tumble became a rolling descent, 4 meters, maybe 5, ending with a jarring impact on a patch of dense grass and tangled roots between 2 pines. The pain exploded through his right shoulder and radiated up his neck, a sharp, fiery ache. For several moments he tried to breathe, tried to gather the sense of where he was, but everything blurred behind the stabbing throb in his head. His vision swam with specks of black and white, like static on an old TV screen. The world around him muffled as if he'd sunk underwater. Slowly that darkness began to close. He didn't know how long he lay there, drifting between fragments of awareness. Time lost its shape, and the frost that dusted his jacket began melting into his clothes, sending chills into his bones. The radio strapped at his side was silent, its antenna bent slightly from the fall. His watch must have cracked. He couldn't see its face, Above him the sky was an indefinite haze. From the corner of fading consciousness he registered something or someone moving nearby. It wasn't a small animal, not a fox or a coyote. The footsteps were heavier, accompanied by the faintest shuffle of grasses. Perhaps he was imagining it, memory or hallucination. It was hard to tell. He blinked, struggling to focus on the edges of his vision. A shadow moved across the ground. Not a human silhouette nor the shape of a bear. Larger in some ways, more graceful in others. Something with four legs, breathing slow and steady, exhaling warm mist into the chilled air. Eli's numb fingers twitched, but he couldn't muster the strength to reach out or even turn his head. His eyelids fluttered, weighed down by exhaustion and shock. There at the edge of the clearing stood a figure backlit by the wan light. It didn't come closer. It simply stood watch. He couldn't see its eyes, but he felt them on him. An unblinking presence. The hush of the morning enveloped them both. No birds called out. No wind whispered through the pines. A wave of cold overcame him, intensifying the ache in his shoulder. His awareness ebbed until he was only half present. His mind skipping through fleeting images, desert nights under foreign skies, the swirl of helicopter blades overhead, a comrade's hand slipping away in the dust. Then his consciousness sank further, leaving behind the faint notion that the ground beneath him was no longer as icy as before. He couldn't recall exactly when everything went dark, only that it was sudden, like a lamp abruptly switched off. The final thing he registered was the towering silhouette still lingering at the periphery, a silent sentinel in the frost. By the time the last of his sensations faded, the sky had grown lighter, hinting at dawn. Snowflakes drifted lazily from a low cluster of clouds, catching in his hair, and on the brim of his hat. The world was quiet except for the distant sigh of the wind as it swept across the ridge. Though he had no way of knowing it, then that silent figure would be the first of many to stand guard before anyone else arrived. In the frozen hush of Sagebrush Basin, an extraordinary encounter was unfolding, one that would upend conventional beliefs about the boundaries between humans and the wilds. Eli McRae, a lone ranger scarred by war and sheltered by silence, lay at the threshold of a mystery he could not yet comprehend. And in that moment he was unknowingly poised on the brink of a profound connection, formed not by words but by the hush of hooves and the quiet breath of a land that had chosen for reasons it would never explain to keep him alive. By the time dawn broke the following morning, it was clear something was wrong. Eli McRae had failed to check in or return to his cabin. In a place like the Sagebrush Basin, preserve where isolation was the norm, going missing for a few hours could be written off as a long patrol, but by sunrise the next day the entire ranger station was on alert. The one most concerned was June Whitaker, Eli's longtime colleague who knew his habits better than anyone else. June was in her early 30s, a steady and capable ranger who had once joked that Eli possessed the survival instincts of a ghost. If he was overdue, it meant something had genuinely gone awry. She didn't wait for an official directive. She assembled 2 junior rangers, checked the station's logs, and found only a brief note from Eli about heading toward Red Bluff Ridge. That was enough. In less than an hour they were bumping along a rough trail in a 4-wheel drive truck loaded with first aid kits, ropes, and a portable search beacon. No one spoke much during the ride. The morning air was biting cold, the sky still bruised with the tail end of night. The truck's headlights cut through patches of thin fog swirling over the dusty road. Each ranger was lost in their own thoughts. They followed a faint signal from a tracking device that Eli typically wore. It was weak and erratic, suggesting he'd fallen, or the device was damaged. Eventually the road ended at a steep decline. Beyond it lay the lower reaches of Red Bluff Ridge, a place best traversed on foot. They set out with caution. June took point, scanning the ground for footprints or signs of fresh disturbance. The other 2 rangers followed a short distance behind, periodically calling Eli's name. Their voices felt swallowed by the silent expanse. No echo, no wind. They'd been hiking nearly half an hour when June spotted a rough patch of snow and broken vegetation leading toward a slight drop-off. Something had slid or fallen here. Her heart jolted. She gestured for the others to stay close. They inched down a precarious slope, boots skidding on loose dirt. At the bottom the land flattened into a small clearing ringed by pines. June was the first to step onto the grass. She drew a sharp breath, stopping so suddenly that the 2 others nearly bumped into her. Eli lay sprawled on his back, arms outstretched, a thin layer of snow clinging to his jacket and hair. His skin was ashen, lips tinged with blue, and he was utterly motionless. But that wasn't what made June's heart hammer in her chest. Forming a loose crescent around Eli were 11 wild Mustangs, their dark silhouettes offset by the pale frost. They stood as if rooted to the ground, heads lowered, ears pinned slightly back but showing no signs of aggression. For an instant June wondered if the horses had caused him harm, yet she saw no kicking, no stomping. Instead they looked protective. The lead animal was a mare of unusual stature, her coat thick and her mane tangling over one eye. A faint scar marred her front right leg, a patch of hair grown unevenly around an old wound. She exuded a quiet authority like a sentinel posted on duty. When the mare took a step forward, just one measured step, June realized that if these horses turned hostile there would be no easy escape. She lifted a hand in a calming gesture, though her pulse pounded. "Easy," she whispered. "We don't want trouble." Behind her one of the junior rangers started to raise his voice. But June hissed for silence. The last thing they needed was to spook a circle of large, powerful creatures. From the center of that circle, Eli lay unmoving, the snow on his chest flecked with small crystals of ice. His ranger hat had tumbled a few feet away, half buried in the slush. The sight of him in such a vulnerable state sent a wave of fear through June. She wanted to rush over check his vitals, but the mare blocked her path, shifting her weight so that she stood squarely between June and Eli. The other Mustangs looked on with an uncanny composure, eyes dark and fixed, their breaths emerged in short visible bursts, like small clouds rising from their nostrils. In unison those clouds gave the impression of an unspoken communication passing among them. One younger horse, smaller in build, took a tentative step forward, leaning its head toward Eli as if to sniff him. Before it could get too close, the mare flicked her neck, guiding the youngster back with a single subtle motion. No bridle, no rope yet. The entire herd moved with choreographed grace, obeying signals no human could replicate. June felt the hairs on her arms stand on end. She had encountered Mustangs before. Usually they kept their distance or bolted at the sight of humans. Confrontations were rare, and typically ended with the horses fleeing. But this was different. They were fully aware of the rescue team's presence, yet they neither fled nor attacked. It was as though they were guarding something sacred. Summoning her courage, June crouched low, speaking softly. "Eli," she called, voice trembling with concern. "Eli, we're here." No response. She could see his shallow breathing, but he remained unconscious, or close to it. The tension in the air was electric, each second stretched taut as wire. Then suddenly the mare exhaled a loud snorting breath, sharp enough to break the hush that held the clearing hostage. That snort acted as a signal. Almost at once the Mustangs began to move, peeling away from the circle in a careful retreat. They walked, not ran, their hooves making dull thuds on the wet ground. One by one they disappeared into the fog beyond the pines, leaving only the mare behind. She lingered, turned her head for a final look at Eli, then slipped away into the hay. June's lungs unlocked. She realized she'd been holding her breath. The two junior rangers also exhaled in relief. Wasting no more time, they rushed to Eli's side. His pulse was weak but present. Within minutes they secured him to a stretcher, rigged a rope system to haul him up the slope, and radioed for additional support. All the while June kept looking toward the trail line, half expecting the Mustangs to reappear. They never did. Back at the ranger station, June submitted a standard incident report and handed over the memory card from a trail camera that by sheer coincidence had been positioned to capture the lower portion of Mesa Creek Trail. The angle wasn't ideal. Much of the view was obstructed by pines and brush, but it showed even from a distance, you could make out the dark forms of the Mustangs, clustered around a figure on the ground, framed by the first light of dawn. June wasn't trying to sensationalize the event. She simply wanted an official record. The footage, she believed, would remain part of the station's confidential files, reviewed only by senior staff and possibly state officials. Instead, a week later, the clip surfaced on a local wildlife blog. From there it exploded across social media, capturing the attention of news outlets, online forums, and television segments. Suddenly the phones at the station rang incessantly. Journalists, self-proclaimed experts, and amateur enthusiasts all wanted interviews. Headlines sprouted like weeds. "When Mustangs become guardians, a ranger's unlikely rescue, wild instincts, or something else. The sagebrush horse mystery. Some speculated that the horses were reacting to the scent of blood, forming a protective circle out of confusion or territorial instinct. Others claimed it was a random incident, no different than if deer or elk had paused out of curiosity before bounding away. But there were those, including experienced ranchers, who insisted this behavior was anything but ordinary. Horses, especially wild ones, typically scattered upon encountering humans. The calm, almost ceremonial vibe around Eli's unconscious body was far from typical flight response. June found herself fielding phone calls she had no interest in answering. A documentary crew emailed her 3 times a day offering money for a guided tour of the exact spot. A national news station asked if she'd appear on a morning show to share the miraculous story. A scientist from a university offered to analyze the footage frame by frame. "It's all speculation," June would reply tersely. "He was hurt. They stood there. That's all." Privately, she felt uneasy about the sudden swirl of attention. Something about the scene she had witnessed felt personal, almost sacred. Each time she recalled the circle of Mustang hooves surrounding the memory wasn't just about an oddity of animal behavior. It carried a weight, a hush that transcended scientific explanation. She didn't want to reduce it to a viral sensation or a bullet point on a talk show. The public reaction, meanwhile, was a cacophony of awe and doubt. Many were enthralled, hailing the Mustangs as noble protectors. Others scoffed, calling it a romantic fantasy that city folks clung to. A few local ranchers shrugged it off, suggesting the horses might have been waiting to see if the fallen figure posed a threat, or if there was feed to be taken. Yet a handful of recognized Mustang trainers came forward saying they'd never seen anything quite like it. One older trainer, in a short interview for a local newspaper, remarked that sometimes horses do what we can't predict. They sense suffering. Not always, but often enough that it makes you question who's really in control out there. At the center of this whirlwind sat June, silent and resolute. When asked to comment further, she gave the same response every time. "I'm just glad we found him. No, I won't speculate. No, I'm not available for an interview." She hated the idea of turning Eli's near-death experience into a spectacle. On top of that, she worried about how he would react once he regained consciousness. Would the hype add to his stress? Would he feel violated that a private moment, albeit one involving wild Mustangs, was now public domain? In the end, the station chief decided to treat it as a curiosity rather than a crisis. They fielded calls, politely declined interview requests, and refused to comment on rumor or speculation. As for June, she simply wished everyone would forget about it. Let nature keep its secrets. But nature's secrets rarely remain hidden for long. The clip continued to circulate online, gathering millions of views. People debated passionately in comment sections, weaving theories that range from the mystical to downright absurd. Memes popped up showing cartoon Mustangs forming a protective ring around various comedic or heroic scenarios. None of it captured the stillness June had felt in that clearing, the sense that something profound was happening beyond human comprehension. And so the story lived on, overshadowing the facts with myth and rumor. The Mustangs had done something neither entirely explained by science nor easily dismissed. The station logs recorded it as an unusual wildlife event, but for those who had been there, it was an encounter that still made the hair on their arms tingle when they recalled how the horses had stood guard unafraid until help arrived. 4 days after being rescued, Eli McRae finally opened his eyes in the makeshift infirmary at the ranger station. His head throbbed and his right shoulder was confined to a padded sling. The fluorescent lights above him buzzed faintly, drilling into his skull with an unsettling hum. For a moment he had no idea where he was or even who he was. Then the memory of falling, tumbling, and the sudden snap of pain came crashing back, and he groaned. "Easy," came a quiet voice. It was June, stepping out from a corner where she'd been perched on a metal folding chair. She moved close, arms crossed, relief plain on her face. Eli tried to speak, but his throat felt raw. After a few moments of swallowing hard, he managed a croaked whisper. "Where? How long?" 4 days, June replied gently, resting a hand on the edge of his cot. "You were unconscious for most of. They had to monitor you for internal injuries. Looks like you'll mend, but it was close." He closed his eyes, letting the words sink in. A swirl of disjointed images flitted through his mind, rolling down the ridge, the sharp sting of cold, something large looming near, something that exhaled warm breath against his face. His heart quickened, though he wasn't sure why. June must have sensed his restlessness. "You remember anything?"
she asked. Her tone was careful, as though afraid of triggering more confusion. Bits and pieces, he muttered, falling. I remember the ice giving way then, cold, and he paused, brows knitting together. I heard footsteps, but not human. Hooves maybe. June didn't respond immediately. She stepped back, rummaging through a small drawer. From it she produced a faded printout, a still frame captured from the station's secreted footage. It was grainy but clear enough to show the silhouettes of Mustangs in a half circle around a limp form on the ground. The limp form was obviously him. Eli's breath caught in his throat. He stared at the image, uncomprehending at first. Then a flicker of memory sparked. This, he whispered. They were there. All 11 of them, June confirmed quietly. We found you in the lower clearing. They didn't run off when we arrived. Not right away. It was almost like, she shrugged, struggling for the right words. They refused to leave you. He turned a paper over in his hands, noticing how his own body lay so still among those towering shapes. A million questions formed in his mind, none of which he could articulate. Eventually he settled on the simplest. I wasn't dreaming. No, June said with a half smile. You definitely weren't. His gaze shifted down to the bandages on his arm. You said 11 Mustangs just standing there. She nodded. Looked like they were guarding you, or at least watching over you, until we showed up. A long silence stretched between them. In that quiet he tried to piece together flickers of recollection. A strong muzzle close to his cheek, the crunch of frost under heavy hooves, and a sense of warmth that seemed to come from nowhere. A fleeting image of white breath in the cold air. He shivered, not from fear but from the overwhelming sense that what had happened wasn't random at all. June cleared her throat. People are talking, you know. He looked at her blankly. The video got out. The cameras near Mesa Creek caught the last few minutes. It's all over the internet. They're calling it a miracle or some primal horse instinct. She paused. I don't know what to think. His lips parted, but he had no word. He felt an odd mixture of vulnerability and irritation. This was his private experience involving a moment of life and death. Now it was fodder for public debate. I just wanted you to know, June continued, so you wouldn't be blindsided by questions. Reporters have been hounding us. They want to know how you feel, what you remember. I've kept them at bay, but thank you, he managed. Another stretch of silence settled, broken only by the faint hum of the overhead light. Finally she asked, do you recall anything else? You said you felt warmth. That's interesting. He closed his eyes, summoning the memory. It was freezing. Then suddenly the wind stopped hitting my face. I heard a snort, felt hot breath near me, like something big stood between me and the wind. That's all I know. June nodded thoughtfully. It lines up with how we found you. One of the Mustangs stood in front of you, blocking the worst of the gale, I guess. A deep sense of awe washed through him, mingled with a quiet confusion. Why would a wild horse, part of a herd that usually avoided human contact, do something so purposeful? He felt a flicker of gratitude, and an even stronger surge of curiosity. Eventually June set the photo down beside his cot. You should rest. You're on the mend, but the doc says, no strenuous activity for a while. He agreed with a nod, too drained to argue. Yet he couldn't shake the nagging urge to see that place again, to understand why the Mustangs had stayed. In the corners of his mind he heard an echo, the dull thud of hooves in the early morning hush, the soft exhalations that hovered like clouds. Just before June stepped out, she turned back with a faint smile. Eli, I'm glad you're still here. Me too, he managed, his voice a low rasp. I owe them my life, don't I? She didn't answer directly, but he saw understanding in her eyes. Then the door clicked shut. Left alone, Eli let his head sink into the thin pillow. His body ached, but his thoughts raced. The image of those Mustangs circled in his mind.
An unspoken question took shape. Had they truly chosen to protect him? And if so, why? In the coming weeks, that question would drive him to push past his injuries, defy orders, and return to the site of his accident. But for now he was confined to recovery, tethered by bandages and painkillers to a world that felt small and artificially lit. Outside, the winter sun drifted across the sky, and the same wind that once scoured his cheeks now whispered through the eaves of the ranger station. He glanced at the grainy photo once more. A semicircle of equine shadows around his still form. A hush seemed to emanate from it even now. The last thing he recalled before falling into an uneasy sleep was the sensation of breath, hot, steady, almost comforting against his chilled face. It was a simple, fleeting memory, yet it carried the weight of an encounter that defied easy explanation. Something that slipped past the boundaries of fear or logic. And in that fleeting recollection, Eli felt a flicker of hope. A sense that maybe, just maybe, the wild had seen something in him worth saving. Billy McRae was supposed to be convalescing at the station clinic. That was the official recommendation from both the department physician and the station chief. Stay put, recuperate, and let the staff evaluate him for any psychological after effects. After all, he had nearly died out there, but on the 10th morning since his accident at Red Bluff Ridge, Eli woke in the pre-dawn darkness, dressed in his usual field clothes, and quietly slipped away. With only a small knapsack in tow, he left no note, no request for transport. The early hour cloaked him as he made his way outside, where the air carried the lingering chill of night. Above him, the sky was a deep indigo, fading at the horizon, signaling the approach of dawn. He moved with deliberate steps, ignoring the twinge in his shoulder. If anyone had asked him why he felt compelled to go, why he risked disobeying direct orders, he wouldn't have known how to answer. There was only the certainty that he needed to return to the place where everything had changed. In his bag he packed a small leather-bound note, a short-bladed knife, his trusty binoculars, and a slender piece of whittled wood, more symbolic than functional. No sidearm, no heavy gear. He told himself it was because he wanted to travel light and quiet. But another part of him recognized a deeper rationale. I'm not going out there to dominate or defend myself. I'm going to listen. He remembered a phrase he'd once written in his journal. If I have to explain what I'm doing, I've already forgotten who I am. The words had made sense then, and they made sense now. No lengthy explanations or farewells. He simply walked away from the station, following the same rough trails that had nearly claimed his life. The Mesa Creek Trail looked much as it had before his accident. The same scattering of rocks. The same scraggly brush that swayed in cold morning breeze. Yet Eli couldn't shake the feeling that the land itself was waiting. That each branch, each tuft of grass, leaned in his direction with quiet anticipation. He paused at a fork in the trail where an old sign warned of unstable ground ahead. The sign had been pounded into the soil years ago, and time had bleached its lettering to a faint echo. Past this point, the route climbed toward a rocky overhang, eventually skirting the edges of Red Bluff Ridge. Normally he'd avoid that section when alone, especially after what had happened, but a subtle urge tugged him forward. As he walked, he noticed hoofprints. Some were faint and older, partially eroded by wind or rain. Others were fresh. They pressed into the moist earth with a confidence that didn't belong to domesticated horses. A small ridgeline of dirt indicated a heavier gait, a stride longer than your average Mustang might leave. Could be the same mare, he thought, or perhaps an entirely different horse from the herd. Rounding a bend, the trail descended into a slight depression, where loose rocks had gathered in a shallow natural basin. This was the area he believed he'd rolled through during his fall, though he had no clear memory of it. Only bruises and vague flashes of pain. Swallowing hard, he climbed down with more caution than before, testing each foothold. The morning light spilled across the stones, making them glint in shades of copper and beige. The spot where June had found him lay further in, near a low stone shelf that jutted out like a broken ledge. The moment he arrived there, a familiar chill prickled across his skin. The air felt charged with memory. He stood still, letting his eyes scan the ground, and then he saw them. Two deep, distinct hoof imprints set close together in the earth. They weren't the scuffle of a horse passing by at a trot. They were the marks of an animal that had stood in one place for a considerable length of time, pressing its weight down. The spacing suggested a large horse front hooves side by side. Eli moved closer, crouching to inspect the edges. No sign of trampling or a hurried departure. No scattered pebbles or sign of scuffing that might indicate restlessness. It looked as though the horse had been calmly rooted here, perhaps for hours. He laid his hand atop one of the indentations, palm fitting neatly within the curved outline. The size matched the memory of that imposing mare, thick-bodied with a scar on her foreleg. He could almost picture her standing watch, ears pricked, eyes scanning for threats. Above him, the sky was still a pale gray, flecked with the trailing remains of dawn's color. He breathed in the crisp air, filling his lungs. They left a message, he wrote in his notebook. The phrase was simple, but it felt right. A sudden flutter of wings startled him. A small sparrow alighted on the edge of the stone shelf, precisely where the hoofprint began. The bird tilted its head, then hopped across the very line of the imprint, as though tracing the boundary. Eli watched transfixed until the sparrow took flight again, disappearing into a nearby juniper. No camera was around to document the sight, no colleague to confirm it. He had only his own eye, his own understanding that something beyond ordinary chance was at work. He rose to his feet, exhaling slowly. In a small hollow of the ledge, he noticed the remains of old pine needles and a faint discoloration on the ground, perhaps a leftover from a damp patch of snow. Regardless, it reminded him of a soft bed, as though something had pressed against the earth here. He looked for any more clues. Nothing, yet an unshakable sense of being observed weighed on him. Not the predatory tension he'd known in war, but a quiet vigilance. It was as if the land itself remembered his fall, and waited to see if he had learned anything. He drew the short piece of whittled wood from his pocket. With careful deliberation, he walked to a slender birch, just off the clearing. The bark was pale, peeling in strips. Using his knife, he carved 3 thin notches, parallel and precise, not deep enough to harm the tree, just enough to leave a sign. Not to mark territory, he whispered under his breath, but to knock on a door. He stepped back. The cuts were unobtrusive, easy to miss if you weren't looking for them, but for him they symbolized a respectful request for entry, a subtle way of announcing, "I'm here and I remember." Standing there, he allowed the hush of the surroundings to envelop him. No dramatic revelations followed, no sudden appearance of a watchful mare. Still, he felt an intangible shift, like finishing a phrase in a conversation that had begun when he was unconscious. He eventually turned away, mindful of his tender shoulder. Before climbing back up to the main trail, he paused once more to let his gaze roam the clearing. He realized he might never fully explain this moment to anyone else, might never find the words for why he felt this pull. But that was all right. Sometimes the most profound truths were the ones you carried in silence. 3 days passed. Eli spent them organizing a few supplies, catching up on minimal tasks, and ignoring the half-hearted admonishments from the station chief about his unauthorized excursion. He said little in response, only confirming that he felt fine physically and mentally. Yet the tug on his spirit to return didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger. On the 3rd morning, he set out again at the same pre-dawn hour. The air tasted of damp sage, a sign that the wind had shifted by the time he reached the branching point near Mesa Creek. The first hints of sunrise edged the horizon with soft gold. He paused at a bend where the trail curved around a small copse of junipers, forming a natural funnel that opened into a wide grassy clearing. Standing still, he let the minutes pass, ears tuned to the environment. Wait, a voice inside him said, "Don't move." A gentle shift in the breeze made him turn his head. He caught the faintest echo of heavy steps, a measured, muffled tread that could only be a horse's. Peering through the junipers, he saw a figure emerge from the brush, a young Mustang, smaller than the adults he'd seen before. Its coat was a pale smoky gray, mane unkempt but short. The horse stepped forward tentatively, as though testing each patch of ground. It didn't snort or paw the earth to announce itself. Instead, it simply came into view and stopped roughly 20 meters from where Eli stood. For a long moment, neither the man nor the horse moved. Eli's heart thudded, not with fear, but with a cautious excitement. Every soldierly instinct told him to remain calm, not to spook the animal by any sudden moves. Slowly, he eased his backpack off one shoulder, lowered it and knelt. He took out a small bag that contained a sliced apple, though he'd told himself earlier he wouldn't rely on food again. Yet he'd decided to bring just a single piece for this exact scenario. An honest offering that said, "I respect you and I'm not here to dominate." Basing the apple slice on a flat stone, he inched back. A few steps. He didn't extend his hand or make any "come here" gesture. He'd learned enough from his first encounter with the mare to know that forcing the issue only bred tension. Instead, he let the breeze carry the scent of fruit to the young horse. The Mustang lifted its head, nostrils quivering. Its ears flicked forward. A single hoof struck the earth in a faint tap. But the horse didn't advance. Instead, it watched Eli as though waiting for him to do more, or to make a mistake. Minutes crawled by. The breeze shifted again, carrying the smell of sage and distant pine. The sky lightened. Eli remained perfectly still, thighs burning from maintaining a crouch.
Finally, the horse exhaled a quiet rumble in its throat. It lowered its head, but not toward the apple. Rather, it simply turned its neck as if deciding that the standoff was over. Then it stepped backward a pace, pivoted with surprising grace, and wandered back the way it had come. No panic, no flight, just a silent departure that left Eli kneeling alone near the junipers. He waited another 10 or 15 minutes, uncertain if the Mustang might return. When it became clear that it was gone, the slice of apple remained on the rock. He decided not to touch it. On his walk back, he detoured to a higher vantage point atop a small ridge. From there he could see into the clearing. The flat stone where he'd left the fruit was barely visible, half concealed by grass. In that moment, a swift shape flickered near the rock, too quick to identify. By the time Eli focused his binoculars, the stone was empty. The apple slice had vanished. He couldn't spot hoof prints or any sign of the horse. But a small involuntary smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Enough to begin," he murmured, echoing a line he'd once heard in a long-ago training exercise. For the first time in many months, maybe years, he felt a spark of genuine hope. Later that day, back at the station, he checked in as usual, responding to minimal tasks, while ignoring curious glances. People knew about the video, the rumors of Mustangs forming a guard around him. No one pressed him for details, perhaps sensing he wasn't ready to talk. But June caught him in the hallway, a questioning look in her eyes. "Are you all right?" He gave the slightest nod. "I am," he said simply. She didn't ask more, perhaps because something in his tone suggested it wasn't open for further discussion. Satisfied with that, she let him be. He spent the rest of the afternoon in quiet reflection, occasionally glancing at his watch, eager for the next dawn when he could return to the clearing. He did just that. 2 days later, this time without any food offerings, determined not to form a pattern where the horses might come to expect handouts. Instead, he wanted to see if they would meet him on different terms, beyond simple hunger. The second encounter arrived unexpectedly as well. Eli was resting against a scraggly pine, surveying the open grassland through his binoculars. Movement caught his eye. He lowered the lenses to discover the same young Mustang from before, edging around the perimeter of the clearing. This time it stepped closer, head tilted in curiosity. Eli held his ground. No gifts, no gestures. The Mustang stopped within 10 meters, breathed in deeply, and let out a soft snort. Eli could feel his pulse quicken, but he made no move toward the horse. With a flick of its tail, the Mustang half-circled him, then trotted off with a burst of energy that suggested playful confidence. Watching it vanish among the brush, Eli exhaled. A part of him wondered if he'd ever truly comprehend the silent conversation taking place here. All he knew was that each time they met,
the young horse lingered longer before departing, as though testing both boundaries and potential trust, and that was enough for now. He felt the uncertain beginnings of a relationship built on neither fear nor force, but something quieter, respect perhaps, or simply a recognition that neither was a threat to the other. Despite the early success of these encounters, Eli soon decided to shift strategies. He realized that food-based interactions, however minimal, might interfere with the true connection he sought. He didn't want the horses to associate him solely with treats, so the next time he hiked out, he brought items of a different nature, objects of meaning to him, though perhaps not of direct utility to wild animals. He carefully laid them out at his cabin before packing. The first was a worn piece of leather, rain frayed at the edges, which he'd salvaged from a ranch fence line years ago. The second was a small tuft of horsehair he'd braided together and bound with a soft strip of suede gleaned from an old saddle shop. Lastly, a snippet of aged cowhide from a battered saddle he'd inherited during his brief stint working near a cavalry base. None of these items were shiny or particularly valuable, but each carried a story, a sense of shared memory between him and the equine world. When he arrived at the clearing he'd begun referring to in his journal as the Silent Ring, he walked its perimeter, searching for a suitable place to leave his tokens. Rather than place them in the center where he might appear too bold or commanding, he opted for the edges, a low rock ledge that faced the open field, elevated just enough for any curious Mustang to spot them from a distance. He set them down gently like offerings on an altar, then backed away until he reached a small outcrop of stone behind a clump of junipers. There he settled in, patient and motionless, content to observe. Days passed. Each morning he repeated the ritual, stopping by the silent ring, observing the tokens, then leaving them in place. He found that occasionally the items had been disturbed, moved slightly or rotated. One day he discovered the braided horsehair rearranged with its knot facing the opposite direction. Another day the snippet of cowhide lay encircled by small smooth stones that seemed unnaturally uniform, as if carefully selected from the creek bed. Eli documented every subtle change in his journal, scribbling notes about angles, possible footprints, and the weather conditions. He never once removed or rearranged the changes he found. His self-imposed rule was to maintain the conversation exactly as the horses left it. He'd stay for an hour or so each time, sometimes longer, simply watching. It was on the fourth or fifth such visit that he began to feel a deeper shift in himself. For years his journal entries had been terse: light wind from Nubnu, 2 hikers spotted at mile marker 3, checked camera, all normal. Now he found himself writing lines that bore a more poetic quality. They prefer low vantage points, the cowl of juniper, not the high ridge, stones placed in a near perfect circle. Could they sense geometry, or is it a synergy of how they move? I don't think they need me to understand. I think they need me to simply be. The simplicity of these observations felt liberating. He no longer had to wedge his experiences into a formal report or reduce them to practical data points. Here in the hush of the preserve, he was free to notice patterns that defied conventional explanation. And with each page he filled, he felt less like an outsider looking in and more like a participant in an ongoing dialogue. One crisp morning he arrived earlier than usual. The sky was still tinted with the last shadows of night, and frost clung to the grasses. At the silent ring's perimeter he noticed fresh marks, small hoof prints likely from the young Mustang that had come to investigate him. But this time there was something else, a neat swirl of flattened grass near the rock ledge, as though a horse had lain down or rested there for a moment. He scanned for any sign of droppings or scratch marks, but found none. Instead, the tuft of braided horsehair was placed neatly in the center of that swirl, covered by a sprig of brittle sage that looked recently plucked. It was such a deliberate arrangement that he felt an odd flutter of excitement. We're communicating, he thought, even if I can't say how or why. He sat down, leaning against a large stone, letting the quiet seep in. Above, faint bird calls signaled the start of a new day. He closed his eyes, imagining the Mustangs moving through the preserve at night, unseen, purposeful, possessing an ancient knowledge of these lands. Perhaps they were aware of his presence beyond mere curiosity. Perhaps they too were exploring an unspoken possibility that not all humans wanted to dominate or break them. Over the next week this exchange continued. One day the piece of cowhide ended up on a small rock turned upright as if displayed. Another day a ring of pebbles encircled the braided horsehair in a near-perfect circle. He found no footprints large enough to match a human shoe. He occasionally spotted a single hoof print, suggesting a single curious horse had taken it upon itself to do the rearranging, or maybe more than one had cooperated. Eli's sense of wonder grew. He stayed longer at the silent ring, sometimes well past midday, jotting notes or simply letting his mind wander. He realized he hadn't felt such peace in years. His old anxieties, the restless guilt from his time in the military, seemed to recede, replaced by a quieter, more grounding awareness. He also began to sense that the land itself was guiding him, or at least permitting him a glimpse of its hidden rhythms. Once he found a row of flattened grasses tracing a gentle arc toward the creek bed. Each bend in the arc aligned with small scuff marks in the earth. Following them led him to a shallow pool where he glimpsed fresh hoof tracks and water still rippling from recent activity. They were just here, he scribbled in his journal, pulse quickening. The sense of closeness to the herd took a turn from metaphorical to literal one late afternoon. He'd been crouched near a cluster of junipers watching the clearing from afar when he caught sight of movement. A half-dozen Mustangs meandered across the far edge of the silent ring, cropping grass and swishing their tails. He recognized the young one, the gray coat shining in the slanting sunlight. For a minute or two they grazed peacefully, apparently unaware or unconcerned by Eli's presence. Then, as if compelled by an unseen signal, they drifted away as silently as they had come. He didn't attempt to approach them. Any abrupt move would shatter the delicate balance. Instead, he merely felt gratitude for being allowed to witness their daily life, unvarnished by human interference. In the quiet of that moment, he named this place in his mind the Silent Ring, a circle formed not just by the small tokens they exchanged, but by the very absence of words that made their connection possible. It began as an ordinary morning, thin clouds overhead, the sky tinted a dull coppery hue and a light haze hanging over the landscape. Eli set out earlier than usual, a faint sense of anticipation gnawing at him. He brought with him a small leather pouch that held a length of weathered rein from a failed Mustang rescue attempt. 2 years prior, one of the few times he had ventured deeper into horse matters. The rescue had been unsuccessful, leaving him with a raw memory of what human intervention could do, even with the best intentions. Today he wanted to leave that memory in the clearing as well, hoping it might represent atonement or simply an honest gesture. Here is my sorrow, my failure for you to see. He reached the Silent Ring at dawn, the ground still damp from a light drizzle the night before. The air felt heavy with expectation, so much so that Eli paused on the outskirts, scanning the slopes for any sign of movement. That was when he sensed it. A presence watching from above. Atop a small rocky ledge to the west stood the mare. He recognized her instantly from her stance, the thick mane draping over her shoulder and a faint scar across her foreleg. She might have been standing there the whole time, silent and still, waiting. Eli's breath caught. This was no fleeting glimpse. The mare made no move to hide or vanish. Instead, she observed him with an unwavering gaze. Her dark eyes reflected the subdued morning light. An invisible current seemed to flow between them, as though each were measuring the other's intent. He felt the urge to bow, to signal some form of respect, yet he knew any dramatic gesture might be misinterpreted, so he simply let his arms hang at his sides, ensuring his posture remained neutral, unthreatening. The mare didn't shift her weight or look away, her silhouette crowned by the faint glow of the rising sun. They stood like that for half a minute, maybe more, the silent standoff palpable. Eli's heart thudded, a surge of adrenaline mixed with awe. Here she was, the same horse that had lingered around his fallen body after the accident, the one rumored to be the herd's matriarch. Finally, he stepped forward slowly, each footfall measured, until he reached the flat rock at the perimeter of the Silent Ring. He placed the leather pouch upon it, careful to avoid making any abrupt movements. Then he backed away, returning to a spot near a juniper cluster, where he had a clear view of both the mare and the offering. The morning breeze picked up, rustling the sparse grass. The mare remained statuesque, ears angled forward, listening. Eli couldn't tell if she was aware of the significance of what he'd brought, but he knew symbolism often transcended explicit explanation. Sometimes, it was enough to perform the act itself and trust that meaning would resonate. Seconds turned into minutes. He allowed the hush to envelop them, observing the subtle changes in the mare's stance. A twitch of her flank, the flick of her tail, a slight shift of her ears. He thought about his time in the military, how body language could speak volumes in tense negotiations, how entire conflicts could pivot on the smallest gesture. Now, across species and without word, he found himself in a similarly delicate dance of trust. At length the mare exhaled, a soft huff that broke the stalemate. She took a single step along the ridge, as though acknowledging his presence. Eli felt a surge of relief wash over him, a sense that he hadn't overstepped some invisible boundary. Drawing in a steady breath, he sat on a low boulder. The vantage point let him keep an eye on the mare, while giving her plenty of space. He had no illusions. She could bolt or disappear into the brush at any moment. He'd be powerless to stop her, but that wasn't his aim. He only wanted to be present. As the breeze shifted, carrying fresh scents from the basin below, Eli thought he detected a faint whiff of sage. The mare's ears twitched and she slowly pivoted her head. Scanning the clearing, her dark eyes flickered, finally settling on the small leather pouch. For a moment it seemed she might descend the slope, approach the offering. Instead, she raised her head high, nostrils flaring as though sampling the air. Though she didn't move closer, that single gesture told Eli everything he needed to know. "I see what you've done. I acknowledge it," He sat there letting time stretch, allowing the scene to unfold naturally. Off in the distance, a faint rustle suggested other horses might be nearby. But none emerged. Perhaps they were content to let their matriarch handle this strange exchange. Eventually, the mare shifted her weight, taking one slow step away from the ridge. She turned her head only slightly enough to break eye contact. Then, with deliberate calm, she walked off into a cluster of shrubs and vanished from sight. No backward glance, no dramatic farewell. She simply left, and the world fell silent again. Eli released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He stood, knees surprisingly stiff, and went to examine the pouch. It was untouched, still resting exactly as he'd placed it. But that didn't disappoint him. The point wasn't for the mare to accept or reject it in any obvious way. The point was that she'd seen it, and him. Without hostility, he reached for his notebook. On a fresh page he wrote, "Some things aren't said out loud yet. They're understood. They don't need me to figure them out. They just need me to be here on time." He closed the notebook and slid it back into his pocket. Outside of a few scattered footprints, some from him, some likely from the mare, there was no concrete evidence that anything remarkable had happened. But he felt a quiet confirmation pulsing in his chest, a sense that the threads connecting them were growing stronger, woven by moments of silent respect. As he left the clearing, stepping onto the trail leading back to the station, he couldn't help feeling that a new chapter of his life was unfolding, one in which words were secondary to presence. The land, the herd, and this solitary mare who had once stood guard over his broken body were leading him to a realm beyond rational explanation. And for the first time in many years, he welcomed the mystery. He paused at the edge of the clearing, turning to glance back one last time at the ridge. The sun had fully risen, casting long shadows across the rolling terrain. The mare was nowhere to be seen, but a stirring in the brush reminded him that she was never far. With that thought, he headed home, unaware of how deeply this unfolding bond would reshape him, or the lengths he'd go to protect it. Yet in his journal he'd leave a clue for his future self. We don't share a language, but we share a moment in time. And sometimes that's enough. Dr. Ben Vale was the kind of man whose curiosity wouldn't let him sleep at night if he sensed a mystery on the horizon, especially a mystery involving wild horses. At 34, he was already regarded as a rising name in wildlife biology. A year before, his paper on intergenerational memory networks in Mustang herds had sparked both acclaim and controversy in academic circles. Some praised his innovative fieldwork, others dismissed him as overly romantic about the animal's cognitive capacities. But Vale paid little heed to the skeptics. He believed the biggest breakthroughs often lay beyond conventional wisdom. So when rumors reached him about an enigmatic silent ritual between a reclusive park ranger and a herd of Mustangs in the Sagebrush Basin preserve, he couldn't resist. The details were sketchy at best. Something about a ranger who'd nearly died only to be guarded by wild horses until help arrived. Then in the weeks that followed, there were whispered accounts of offerings left in a clearing, bridles, braided horsehair, bits of old tack, and the Mustangs apparently responding in turn. Vale was deep into another project at the time, documenting large herd migration, yet the tale gnawed at him until he finally made up his mind. He had to see it for himself. He told no one at the local ranger station of his intentions. Instead, he arrived at dawn piloting a dusty SUV along the rutted roads outside the preserve's boundary. He'd gleaned just enough directions from a small ranch near the outskirts to navigate. It was a frigid morning. Frost rimed the edges of windshield glass, and the open fields wore a pale sheen under a grayish sky. As he parked and stepped out, the cold sliced through his jacket, but he relished the adrenaline that sparked in his veins. This was the moment he lived for. With a compact backpack slung over one shoulder and a DSLR camera hanging from his neck, Vale trudged along a faint trail until he reached a natural depression, a place that felt oddly still. He spotted a circle of low rocks up ahead, reminiscent of something carefully arranged, though he couldn't see precisely how. Then just beyond those stones he glimpsed a man crouched near a flat rock, placing what looked like a slender strip of braided horsehair atop it. Vale paused, uncertain how to announce himself. Before he could decide, a twig snapped under his boot. The man rose instantly, turning with a guarded expression. Vale lifted a hand in what he hoped was a friendly gesture. He called softly, not wanting to spook the horses. He assumed must be nearby. "I'm Dr. Ben Vale. I just wanted to witness this. I've heard stories." The figure before him, presumably Eli McRae, looked every bit as rugged as the rumors suggested. Lean, with a quiet intensity that could freeze a lesser man in place. The ranger's gaze flicked to the camera around Vale's neck, then back to his eyes. "You came the wrong way," Eli said, voice low, each syllable measured. "But you're here now." He didn't extend a hand, nor did he walk away. Instead, he stepped aside as if to keep Vale at the periphery of the clearing. Vale noticed a subtle tension in the air, as though he'd walked into a half-finished ceremony. The arrangement of stones, the objects on them, even the hush in the surrounding brush. Everything felt poised. He swallowed hard. "I mean no disrespect," he said. "I've devoted my life to understanding how Mustangs communicate, especially the older matriarchs." "I heard you." Eli gave a fractional shake of his head. "We don't talk much here," he interrupted, glancing at the sky. "We mostly listen." The words were cryptic, yet Vale found them strangely resonant. He was about to ask how many horses were in the area, when he glimpsed movement at the edge of his vision. A shape emerged from behind low shrubs, a young Mustang, coat pale in the cold light. It took a few cautious steps, ears pricked, staring at Eli and Vale with obvious curiosity. Almost at once, a larger form followed. A mare, dark-furred with a thick mane that hung over her neck. The matriarch, by the look of her. His pulse leapt. "This is it. This is the contact I came for." Without thinking, he lifted his DSLR, adjusting the focus. The mare's eyes locked on him with an intensity he could feel in his bones. A fleeting warning danced through his mind. Maybe photography wasn't welcome here, but excitement overrode his caution. "Just one shot," he whispered. "Don't move." He pressed the shutter. Click. The sound reverberated like a small thunderclap in the otherwise profound silence. Immediately, Vale sensed a shift, as though the invisible cords binding this moment together had been severed. The mare lowered her head, a subtle but unmistakable posture that placed her between the younger horse and the intruders. No braying, no charge, but the tension sharpened. Her gaze turned cold, almost accusatory. She angled her body so that the Mustang behind her was partly shielded. Eli moved, sliding in front of Vale's camera with eerie calm. He didn't yell or wave his arms. He simply stood there, blocking the lens. "We don't take pictures," he said quietly. "Not here, we just." They realized he'd made a grave mistake. A wave of shame prickled his neck. The hush he'd interrupted felt almost alive, as though it had recognized him as an intruder. "I'm sorry," he managed. I didn't think." "That's the problem," Eli said, his voice scarcely louder than a whisper. "You were thinking, instead of listening." Vale opened his mouth to reply, but the distant stomp of a hoof drew his attention. The mare was already moving away, the young horse in tow. Their steps were deliberate, the arcs of their muscled bodies stiff with caution. Within seconds, they faded into a pale haze that clung to the horizon. It took Vale another moment to realize he was holding his breath. When they were gone, the clearing felt empty, the tension replaced by a hollow quiet. Eli let out a slow exhale. Stepping aside, Vale studied his face, seeing the anger there, but also something like disappointment. "I really am sorry," Vale repeated. For a moment Eli said nothing. Then he turned away. Words clipped. What's done is done. Later that evening, the biting cold intensified around the Sagebrush Basin, and a sky thick with stars offered only a pale glow. Eli stood on the porch of his cabin, arms folded. When he heard an engine approach, the rumble ceased, and soon the figure of Dr. Ben Vale emerged from the gloom, his breath visible in the frosty air. "I'm unarmed," Vale joked weakly, lifting both hands, "but I do have something I'd like to say, if that's all right." Eli considered him in silence, then gave a single nod. He opened the cabin door, letting the visitor enter. Inside, the warmth from a wood-burning stove radiated through the cramped space, and shadows danced on the walls. A single overhead lantern cast a mellow light onto a small wooden table. Vale took in the surroundings: minimal furnishings, battered cupboards, and a stack of notebooks on one shelf.
They sat across from each other, with only a metal thermos and 2 chipped ceramic mugs on the table between them. Vale cleared his throat. I appreciate you not running me off. I know I crossed a line out there. Eli stared at the stove's flames. You did? A fleeting silence followed then. Vale unclipped a small memory card from his camera and placed it on the table. I took 3 photos before I realized what I was doing. They're clear, high resolution, and you can see the mare's posture. In my field, publishing those images could be a significant breakthrough. The concept of a matriarch controlling interactions with humans, maybe even passing that knowledge along to younger horses, would bolster everything I've been studying. Eli listened, the firelight casting long shadows over his face. Finally, he pulled open a drawer and withdrew a short length of braided rein. The leather was old, frayed in places but carefully knotted back together. When I was younger, he said softly, I'd tried to help with a Mustang rescue. We did everything by the book. Tranquilizers, gentle handling, the works. It still went wrong. The horse tore half the corral down, nearly broke her own neck. I realize we don't understand them as well as we pretend to. Vale turned the memory card over in his fingers. You're saying we should never try? Eli shook his head, letting the reins slide between his calloused palms. What you saw today, do you really think it was about science? The biologist pressed his lips together, recalling how the entire clearing had shifted after that single camera click. The energy, he had felt it almost physically, as though a doorway had been slammed shut in his face. It felt larger than me, he admitted, as if the whole space was telling me to leave. Outside, a sharp gust of wind rattled the shutters, but inside, the flames continued their steady crackle. Vale found himself turning the memory card between his thumb and forefinger. He pictured the images stored there, the mare's dark shape, the younger horse poised behind her, the subtle protective arc of her body. At length he rose. Excuse me, he murmured, stepping toward the stove. Eli watched unblinking, as Vale lifted the stove's heavy iron lid, revealing glowing coals beneath. Without ceremony, Vale dropped the memory card into the embers. The plastic sputtered and curled, a pungent scent wafting upward. No one spoke for several seconds. The only sound was the low hiss of melting circuitry. Finally, Vale turned around, meeting Eli's gaze. I once believed every wonder had to be proven, he said quietly, that if we couldn't show it to the world, it didn't exist. But now I see some things. They belong where they are. This might be one of them. Eli didn't break eye contact. The flicker of flames danced across his features. And sometimes, he said, the biggest miracle is choosing to keep silent. A fragile calm settled over the cabin, though they'd barely exchanged more than a handful of sentences. It felt as though an entire gulf of understanding had been crossed. Vale returned to his seat, letting the tension slip from his shoulders. He toyed with the rim of his mug. I'm not done being curious, he confessed, but I'll respect the boundary. If I stay around a while, do you think I might observe, without intruding? Eli considered. Hard to say. The land decides. The horses decide. He set the braided rein on the table, aligning it carefully, so the knots faced outward. I do know one thing. If they sense you're looking for something beyond data, they might let you see more. A wry smile tugged at Vale's lips. No promises, he replied, tapping the side of his head. Science is in here. Then he placed a hand over his chest. But I think there's something in here too, telling me to tread softly. I'll do my best. They lapsed into a comfortable quiet, the warmth of the stove filling the small space. Out beyond the cabin's walls, the wind continued its restless wander through the plain, carrying the secrets of the Sagebrush Basin in unseen currents. Within those secrets dwelled a herd of Mustangs that had chosen by their own inscrutable reasons to show a battered ranger a compassion that defied conventional logic. Vale stayed a while longer. They spoke in low tones about minor things, the sound of wind across the ridge, the best places to find fresh water, which local ranchers were least prone to interfering with wild herds. As the night deepened, the flicker of the fire drew elongated shapes on the floor, dancing silhouettes that looked like phantom horses from some distant age. When at last Vale stepped out into the cold, he paused on the porch. A vast sky filled with stars stretched overhead, the constellations unwavering in the darkness. He breathed in the crisp air, aware that tomorrow would be a new day of slow steps, quiet observation, And above all, humility. The memory card was gone, its contents consigned to the flames. Yet for the first time in his career he felt the weight of a revelation that didn't need to be published to have meaning. Before he climbed into his SUV, he glanced back at the cabin. Through the small window he could see Eli's silhouette by the stove, the braided reins still on the table. They exchanged a brief nod, a silent farewell for the night. Then Vale turned the ignition, and his headlights cut across the darkness, leading him away from the outpost ranch house. Inside, Eli stooped to add another log to the embers. He watched sparks spiral upward, thinking of the photographs that would never see the public eye. A soft sense of relief and gratitude washed over him. Some mysteries, he mused, belonged to the hush of the desert and the memory of wild horses. No data chart or published paper could capture the intangible presence he'd felt among them. With that thought, he sank into a battered chair, letting the fire's warmth seep into his bones. Tomorrow he'd head back out to the silent ring as usual. Perhaps the mare would be there, or perhaps she'd remain hidden in distant hills. Either way, he trusted that what needed to happen would unfold without fanfare. Sometimes, he reflected, the wild chooses you, and that's reason enough to keep it close to the heart. Eli McRae had always prided himself on reading the land's subtle cues. The tilt of a lone juniper under a gusting wind, the color change along a creek that hinted at upstream rainfall. This time, though, he felt something else, something layered beneath the typical meteorological patterns. The official forecasts warned of a fast-moving low-pressure system, likely to bring heavy rain for the next. That, combined with early snowmelt, raised the risk of landslides and flash floods. Over the past week, Eli had noticed coyote fords, once gentle streams surging with muddy vigor. Each day the waterline crept higher, small eddies swirling with bits of broken wood and leaves. On this particular morning, as he set out to check remote sections of the preserve, a peculiar shift in the wind nagged at him. It wasn't just cold, it had a twisting, unsettled quality, like an invisible whirlpool sucking in the surrounding air. The sky hung gray and low, hinting at storms yet to form. Part of him wanted to turn back and wait it out, but an instinct, perhaps the same one that had guided him among the horses, told him he needed to press on. Several hours later, as he headed home, the wind picked up dramatically. Clouds gathered in thick clusters pregnant with the weight of imminent rain. A sudden shrill noise cut through the gusty air, too sharp to be a normal breeze,
too distinct to be random. It took Eli a moment to realize it was a horse's whinny, ragged and broken. Alarm trickled through him. Wild Mustangs rarely neighed in such a distressed manner. He quickened his pace, following the sound across a slight rise in the terrain. Reaching the crest of a small knoll, he peered down toward Coyote Ford. What should have been a shallow stream bed was now a raging torrent of muddy, rust-colored water. Debris tumbled through the current, branches, clumps of grass, even small uprooted shrubs. Squinting, Eli spotted movement near the center of the water, a pale gray shape thrashing against the flow. It took him only a second to recognize the outline of a young Mustang. The foal looked to be the same gray youngster he'd encountered at the silent ring, now caught in the swirling flood, half submerged and flailing. One of its four legs was trapped by a tangle of drifting roots, preventing it from swimming freely. Each frantic kick sent up dark sprays of water. Its head jerked above the surface, eyes rolling in panic. It was far too small to navigate such a powerful current on its own. Without hesitation, Eli set down his pack and pulled a length of rope from it. The slope was too steep for a direct descent, so he looped one end of the rope around his waist and secured the other to a stunted pine perched at the edge. The wind bit at his cheeks and the roar of the flood filled his ears. He had no time for second thought. Taking a deep breath, he clambered down the muddy bank until the water surged around his knees. Each step threatened to topple him, the current far stronger than he expected. Still, he pressed on inch by inch until the frigid flow reached his waist. His boots slipped on unseen rocks beneath the swirling sediment. Gripping the rope for stability, he lunged forward. A wild eddy yanked him sideways, nearly plunging him under. The cold bit like 1,000 needles. He spat out muddy water, blinking to clear his vision. 20 feet away, the foal slammed against a bobbing mass of roots, too exhausted to thrash effectively. It didn't fight him when he grabbed hold. Perhaps it recognized that any movement could be fatal. "Easy," he rasped, voice hoarse from the cold. He wrapped an arm around the foal's neck, hooking the rope beneath its chest. If the animal had panicked, it might have inadvertently dragged them both under, but it remained eerily still as though shock had dulled its reaction hand over hand. Eli tugged on the rope, each pull requiring every ounce of strength he had left. The current pummeled them, trying to rip them away from the tenuous lifelines secured on the bank. His lungs burned from the effort, and with each ragged breath he inhaled droplets of muddy water. Still, he forced himself to continue, refusing to let go of the foal. Slowly, painfully, they drifted closer to the shallows. At last, his feet found purchase on the slick riverbed near the bank. With a final surge, he heaved the foal onto a stretch of sodden ground. They both collapsed in a spattering of mud and water, sliding an extra few feet before coming to rest on a patch of silt. Eli coughed violently, retching out the filth he'd swallowed. For a moment he couldn't see or hear anything but the pounding of blood in his ears. Time blurred. Eli had no sense of how long he lay there, half-conscious. Eventually the roaring in his head subsided enough that he felt raindrops pelting his exposed face. He blinked and groaned, forcing himself to sit up. A wave of vertigo struck, but he steadied himself, remembering why he was here. The foal stood a few feet away, trembling, water streaming from its matted coat, its wide eyes fixed on him as if unsure what to do next. Eli pushed himself onto his knees, each muscle protesting. He reached out a hand, expecting the horse to shy away. Instead, it stepped closer, sniffing the air. Its muzzle brushed his cheek, soft and tented. "You're all right," he whispered. Though he wasn't sure who he was trying to reassure, the horse or himself. The contact felt surreal, a fleeting moment of tenderness against the backdrop of roaring floodwaters and a darkening sky. Fat droplets of rain pummeled them both, but neither moved for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Eli managed to get to his feet, staggering under the weight of exhaustion and the pull of the rope still around his waist. He glanced up at the slope above. The pine to which he'd tied his rope swayed dangerously, but it had held, reeling in the rope. He made slow, steady progress toward higher ground, the foal following him in halting step. When they reached a small plateau above the water, Eli collapsed again, chest heaving. The adrenaline that had fueled his rescue was gone, leaving him shaky and nauseous. Rain drenched him to the core. The temperature felt like it was plummeting by the minute. Dimly, he registered a shape moving on a distant ridge. He squinted through the sheets of rain high above them. Silhouetted against a stormy sky stood a larger Mustang coat, dark and glistening with the wet. Even at this distance, Eli knew it had to be the man. She didn't move closer or call out. Instead, she simply observed. A long breath, invisible even from afar, rolled from her muzzle like a question or perhaps an acknowledgement. Eli lifted his head, letting the rain wash mud from his eyes. He didn't raise a hand in greeting. It felt unnecessary. In the hush of that moment, despite the howling wind, something unspoken passed between him and the mare. It was as if she had been waiting to see if he would save the youngster when it truly mattered. He lowered his chin, a simple acceptance of what he'd done. "I did what I could," he thought. The mare lingered another few seconds, then turned and vanished behind a crest of rock. The gray foal, exhausted, huddled beside him, shivering in the downpour. As darkness threatened the edges of his vision, Eli knew he needed shelter, and fast. Somehow Eli managed to lead the foal back to his cabin. The journey took hours, navigating rain-slick paths and detours around half-flooded gullies. The chills sank into his bones and waves of dizziness tested his resolve. By the time he reached the outpost ranch house, he was so soaked and drained that he nearly collapsed on the doorstep. The young horse stumbled behind him, favoring a bruised leg, but otherwise staying close. Inside, the cabin was dark except for the faint glow of embers in the wood stove. Eli fumbled for matches, lighting the nearest lantern with trembling fingers. His head swam with feverish intensity. He could feel the onset of chills and suspected a looming infection. Stripping off his wet jacket, he hung it near the stove, then coaxed the fire to life with fresh logs. The blaze crackled, warmed, gradually replacing the cabin's icy interior. Outside, the storm raged on, lightning flickering across the sky. He heard soft hoofsteps on the porch and realized the foal had followed him. Stopping just shy of the open doorway, Eli propped the door ajar, letting some of the heat spill onto the porch. He didn't step out to usher the horse. Some boundaries he sensed shouldn't be crossed. Instead, he silently invited the youngster to remain if it wished. Hours later, as the storm deepened, Eli dozed fitfully in a chair near the stove, wrapped in a thin blanket.
His shoulder ached and his lungs felt tight. Through the haze of fever, he caught the rhythmic drumming of rain against the roof, punctuated by a gentle scraping sound, the foal shifting its hooves on the porch. He forced his eyes open, peering through the half-lit space. Even from here he could see the curve of its flank outside, an ashen silhouette in the flickering light. He let the door remain ajar all night, allowing the heated air to drift outward. Every so often he heard the foal let out a muted whicker, or stamp at the wet boards. Otherwise it stood quietly, refusing to leave. Exhaustion finally overcame Eli in the small hours of morning, and he slipped into a restless sleep, the memory of swirling floodwaters chasing him through his dreams. When dawn arrived, the rain had eased to a persistent drizzle. Eli woke to the rasp of his own cough and the faint smell of damp earth. His muscles protested every movement as he pushed himself upright, rubbing his eyes. The world beyond the door glowed a pale watery gray, with droplets sliding off the cabin's eaves. He found the foal still on the porch, standing now with its head lifted, ears angled toward the open doorway. The young horse gazed at him, no fear, no impatience, just a soft presence. Eli managed a slight nod, acknowledging it, the way one might greet an old friend. No words, no gesture. He didn't feel compelled to pat its muzzle or attempt any display of ownership. The horse didn't need comforting in that way. Their bond, if it could be called that, was built on an unspoken mutual respect. "Good morning," he whispered, voice rasped. The foal blinked. Then it shook off droplets from its coat and stepped carefully onto the wet ground. For a moment it seemed to glance back at the threshold as if to say goodbye. Eli noticed faint tracks where the horse had circled in place. During the night, a ring of disturbed mud indicated it might have lain down for a while. He rose unsteadily and made his way to the doorway. With the last remnants of drizzle tapping the roof, he squinted into the pale daylight. The foal lifted its head, sharing a lingering glance, then trotted off into the drenched underbrush. Eli let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He felt lighter somehow, even with the fever still nagging at his bones. They had shared the storm, each giving the other what they needed: warmth, space, and the promise of help if danger returned. That entire day Eli stayed indoors, stoking the fire to keep the chill at bay. His body needed rest. He felt the dull ache in every limb, especially in his bruised rib. From the window he watched the clearing behind his cabin, half expecting the foal or perhaps the mare to appear again. But the hours stretched on without so much as a flicker of movement among the soggy thicket. At one point he opened his journal, intent on recording the details of the rescue, but found himself staring at a blank page. What was there to prove anymore?
The frantic pull of survival had overshadowed any notion of data or evidence. The truth of what happened existed in his aching muscles and the memory of the foal's muzzle brushing his cheek. No tidy explanation or photograph could capture the rawness of that moment. He settled for scribbling a single line. Sometimes trust is built in the space where words fail. Then he set the journal aside, letting silence speak on his behalf. As the day wore on, the rain gradually subsided, leaving the landscape glistening under a tentative sun. Eli opened the cabin's windows to let in the damp, fresh air. Though his fever lingered, he sensed a shift within himself. The tension that once laced his every thought about duty, about science, about whether he was intruding on the horse's domain had loosened. He understood now that their connection required no official sanction. When night fell again, he kept the cabin door partially open, hoping for another sign of the young Mustang, yet the porch remained empty, the night quiet except for dripping eaves. A sense of calm enveloped him, free from the usual anxious undertones of waiting. If the horse returned, it would be on its own terms. If not, that was fine too. They had shared an ordeal that no one else could ever replicate. A week later, the floodwaters receded, leaving behind ragged banks and piles of debris. The entire preserve looked changed. Riverbeds shifted, paths washed out. During that time, Eli had quietly packed a few personal belongings into a worn canvas backpack. There was no dramatic announcement, no farewell speech. He simply walked into the main ranger office one morning. With a folded piece of paper, he set his badge and keys on the desk of the station chief. A concise resignation letter tucked beneath them. A single line at the bottom read, "I've done what needed to be done, now I'm going." He offered no further explanation. The station chief eyed him with a mixture of respect and puzzlement. Eli had never been one for ceremony, so perhaps this final understated act suited him. There were no goodbyes. Most of the staff were out dealing with post-storm repairs or analyzing the damage to remote trails. Besides, Eli preferred to slip away unnoticed. Over the last few months, the station had bristled with rumors about the Mustang encounters, some calling it incredible, others scoffing at the notion of horses protecting a human. Eli had no desire to correct or confirm any of it. Back at the outpost ranch house, he took inventory of what little he possessed. A battered pair of binoculars, a leather notebook stuffed with scribbled entries, half-finished sketches and dried bits of sage pressed between pages. A small satchel containing the objects he'd exchanged at the silent ring, bridles, braided horsehair, and a tuft of worn saddle leather. These items carried more meaning than any official uniform or plaque ever could. He decided to leave behind the radio, the old generator, even most of his cooking utensils. Traveling light felt necessary. I no longer need directions, he told himself, remembering the times he'd roamed the preserve guided by something deeper than maps. Whether that impulse was memory, instinct, or something else entirely, he trusted it more than any modern gadget. Before he closed the cabin door for the last time, he paused to carve 3 small notches into the wooden frame. A subtle echo of the first marks he'd made near Red Bluff Ridge. A silent message, perhaps to himself or to whoever might wander there next. I was here and I respected this place. On his way out, he detoured to the clearing he'd come to cherish. The sky was a delicate wash of pale blue and the sun cast gentle warmth on the newly sprouted grass. A breeze ruffled the edges of the clearing, carrying the faint scent of pine and wild sage. He stood at the perimeter of the silent ring, letting the memory of all that had transpired wash over him. The cautious gifts he'd placed, the rearranged stones he'd discovered, the footprints of a mare that had once stood by him when he lay broken on the ground. No visible trace remained of these events. The clearing looked as if it had never been touched by human hands. Taking a steady breath, Eli stepped into the space he'd long used for leaving offering. This time he didn't set anything down. Instead, he simply stood head bowed, feeling the earth under his boots. The hush enveloped him. For a few minutes he closed his eyes, listening to the wind's gentle hum. Then, soft as a whispered prayer, he spoke words he'd never dared speak aloud. "Thank you for waiting." A swirl of wind lifted the corners of his hair as though acknowledging the sentiment. In that moment he felt no sadness, only a profound gratitude. Life, he realized, was calling him elsewhere, yet part of him would remain woven into this land. With a final nod toward the clearing, he turned and walked away. The gentle crunch of grass underfoot, the only sound marking his departure. Eli traveled for several hours, winding through lesser-known trails that eventually arced back toward the site of his original fall near Red Bluff Ridge. He wasn't sure why he felt drawn there one final time. Perhaps it was a need to tie up loose ends, or simply a tribute to the place where a silent bond had been forged. When he reached the familiar plateau of broken rocks and twisted pines, he realized something was off. There was an unusual stillness in the air, heavier than normal, pushing through a thin copse of junipers. He arrived at the central spot, the flat stone that had once served as an impromptu altar for his offerings. The sight that greeted him made his heart lurch. Carefully laid out across the stone were 11 small, smooth stones in a perfect circle, each stone about the size of a clenched fist. At the center lay his ranger badge, the same one he'd left in the station, or so he'd believed. Yet here it was, polished free of dust, gleaming in the mild sunlight. Next to it, a delicate sprig of grass was neatly placed, reminiscent of how Eli used to leave small tokens. He looked around, half expecting a Mustang to appear from behind the ridge. The clearing was empty. No hoofprints marred the ground. No fresh droppings or obvious trail. But he knew they had been here, or at least one of them had. The arrangement was too deliberate, too precise to be a coincidence of wind or scavenging animals. Stepping closer, he felt a surge of emotion he couldn't quite name. Part awe, part humility. He knelt by the reaching out to touch the badge. A faint scratch across its surface told him it was indeed his own. The date of his induction was etched along the back, though he scarcely remembered the ceremony where that had been done. "How did you?" he murmured, though he knew no one was there to answer. He brushed a fingertip over the grass sprig. It reminded him of the day he'd placed small offerings for the mare, never truly expecting her to respond. Now the rules were reversed. Even the circle of stones felt like a mere image of his own tokens. Their arrangement formed a near-perfect ring, signifying a level of care that defied mere chance. He swallowed against the tightness in his throat, remembering how months ago he had knelt in almost the same spot, forging a wordless conversation. A soft rustle drew his attention to the western edge of the clearing. Emerging from a stand of pine, the dark mare walked with measured steps. She was alone this time, no younger horse at her side. The tension that had so often accompanied their encounters was absent.
Instead, her approach was calm, almost graceful, as though she were finishing a ceremony left incomplete. Eli rose slowly, making sure not to spook her. She halted at a respectful distance, meeting his eyes with a steady, unwavering gaze. For a moment he considered calling out, whispering some thanks or farewell, but words felt inadequate. Instead, he laid a hand over his heart, then inclined his head in a gesture of profound respect. The mare's ears flicked forward. She breathed in, exhaling a warm gust that drifted across the clearing. Eli could swear he felt it even from this distance. A gentle wind stirred the grass, causing the circle of stones to glimmer with a subdued brilliance. For a few beats of his heart they simply existed in that space, man and horse each acknowledging the other. Then with a shift of her weight the mare turned. The sun caught the sheen of her coat, highlighting the faint scar on her foreleg. She walked away with a slow, measured pace, disappearing behind a copse of pines. Eli wanted to follow, but intuition told him that would violate the unspoken rules they had lived by. He remained where he was, letting her departure echo the first day he'd seen her vanish into a swirl of morning mist. In the hush that followed he heard nothing but the faint sigh of wind. No whinny, no final snort, just the land reclaiming its usual stillness. It felt like a benediction, an affirmation that whatever had needed to happen between them was now complete. Turning back to the stone he gazed at the ring of pebbles, and the badge at its center. He wondered if he should take the badge with him or leave it where it lay. After all, it belonged more to the preserve now than to his former life. The memory of that life, of routine patrols, official logs and departmental hierarchies felt distant, even irrelevant. In the end he chose to leave everything as he'd found it. The circle of stones remained unbroken, the badge glinting faintly at its heart. Carefully he placed the sprig of grass back exactly as it had been, ensuring not a single blade was disturbed. He stepped away, conscious of how each footfall on the soil felt like part of a closing chapter. Reaching into his backpack, he withdrew the worn notebook that had accompanied him on so many rounds. In its final pages he jotted a few words. I was never abandoned, I was never alone. I was surrounded, I was chosen. He paused, considering whether to add more, but those lines captured it well enough. The desert, the horses, none of them had left him behind. They had simply let him find his place among them, if only for a time. That understanding, unspoken and unreplicable, meant more than any official recognition. With the gentle scrape of pen on paper finished, he closed the notebook and tucked it away. Light filtered through the sparse canopy, illuminating motes of dust that danced around him. For a moment it felt as though the entire preserve inhaled, waiting to see his next move. Eli exhaled and turned, walking downhill toward a winding path that led away from Red Bluff Ridge. He carried only what he needed, leaving behind the rest: badge, memories, and the silent testimony of a bond that transcended words. The sun was at his back, casting his shadow ahead of him. The next steps were his to choose, uncharted but guided by the rhythms he had come to trust. No one could say where Eli McRae went from there, or what he chose to do with the secrets he carried. Some might guess he wandered to another remote posting, or simply disappeared among the backcountry roads. But in truth he had already left the most vital parts of himself in the Sagebrush Basin. Intangible footprints, shared with a wild herd that had once formed a ring around his broken body, and in so doing had held him in a world few could understand. In time the clearing regained its quiet normalcy. The circle of stones and badge might remain undisturbed for days, or months, or years, known only to the wild horses that occasionally roamed through. And if any future ranger or wanderer stumbled upon that small sacred arrangement, they would see only a curious ring of pebbles, a discarded insignia, and perhaps a faint sense of presence in the air, like an echo of hooves on soft earth, reminding them that sometimes the wild chooses us long before we choose it. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. We'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know your favorite part.
If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories like this one. And don't miss out, hit the notification bell so you're always updated on our latest content. Your support truly means the world to us. Silas Creed's breath was shallow, the forest floor cool beneath him. The moment Storm Vale stepped forward, the air felt charged, almost sacred. Some rescues don't begin with sirens. They begin with hoofbeats and hearts that recognize their own. Deputy Ryland studied the trail left behind. They didn't leave him behind. They led us to him. Dr. Thorne inspected the wounds. This isn't survival, this is allegiance. Those horses didn't flee. They formed a perimeter. Deputy Ryland studied the trail left behind. They didn't leave him behind. They led us to him. Silas Creed's breath was shallow, the forest floor cool beneath him. The moment Stormvale stepped forward, the air felt charged, almost sacred. Stormvale lowered his head to Silas's chest, as if listening for something only the wild could hear.